we get the beginning of the story. It was a man named Abram, and God meets him, has chosen him, has picked him, and he says to Abram in a vision of Genesis 15:1, Abram, do not be afraid. I am your shield and your great reward. And Abraham says very respectfully, thank you, Lord. That's very nice that you're my shield, you're my reward. But what in the world could you give me because I'm childless? And I have no family, and I have no children, so you can offer me whatever, but it doesn't really matter when one of my own servants is just going to take over this estate when I'm gone. I have no heir, I have no flesh. Over the last few weeks, we've looked at the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Rebekah, and Esau, and we've been trying to learn from their lives what we can apply in our lives today. And even though these stories happened almost 4,000 years ago, which is hard to imagine, they're still incredibly relevant to us today. And this morning, as it's Easter weekend, and you're all looking mighty gorgeous, and if your husband didn't tell you, ladies, you look especially nice today, and men, if your wives didn't tell you, I'm not going to tell you. It's just, guys don't do that, I'm sorry. No, I'm kidding. You look very dapper, handsome. And if your wife called you cute, then I'll say you're handsome. You know, she meant well, but I always try to correct my wife when she says I'm cute. What am I, a bunny rabbit? Cute? That's like an insult. It's not what I'm going for. Happy Easter, everyone. It's a special weekend. It's a weekend where we do something we should be doing all year, which is reflecting upon the sacrifice that God made in sending his son, the gift that he gave us. And it's interesting because Paul says in Romans 8, he said, if he did not spare his own son, how would he not also, along with him, give us anything else that you might need? Like, he couldn't give more than a son. I mean, how could you give more than your own child? If he's willing to give that, then I think he'll be willing to give anything else that would be. I mean, that's like the highest. So anything else you would ask of him is lesser. And so if God is that generous and that good, then how would he not also with him give you whatever you need? And Abraham says, what could you possibly give me because I don't have a son? I don't have an heir. I don't have a child. I don't have a family. So you could give me more sheep, goats, servants, whatever, but it's still not going to be the same. Because there's something about family. There's something about that connection. There's something about that love that comes in a family that is irreplaceable. So this morning we're going to do a worship experience. I'm going to invite you to join with me as we journey with Abraham. From this moment where he asked God for something that seems impossible, or at least has been impossible for him and for his wife. And we're going to journey with him as how that gift unfolds, and then how he's asked later to give the gift back, which seems very odd and very strange. And I'm going to give you an opportunity. There's cards that are in the pew in front of you, little index cards, and everybody can take one because I'm going to ask you to write a few things as we go throughout the service today. And if you need a pen or pencil, just wave your hand. We can get you one of those. And if you need to share a card, look around. There's, I think, enough cards for everybody. And you're going to place this card when we're done this morning on our altar. And I want to thank Joe, our administrative assistant, for building such a fine altar, and I think he had some help. And you're going to get to place that on the altar this morning. And I want to tell you, I've done this kind of thing before, not at an Easter service, but in other contexts. I want to tell you an experience I had, because I want you to take this seriously and personally. I did an experience where I had everybody in my congregation write on the card something that they needed to. I think in this case we were nailing it to the cross, and we brought it to a cross that we had up here. and something they needed to give to God, something that they felt impressed that as we worship this morning, they felt impressed to write, to put on the cross, to leave it on the cross, to give to God. And I told the members of the congregation that I would burn the cards, just kind of symbolically. In the Bible, we have this concept of a burnt offering, which is offered, and the smoke and the flames kind of go up to heaven. And so whatever on that card goes up to God in this beautiful kind of ritual and symbolic gesture. And I want to tell you that when I collected those cards after church, and I took them, and I had, at that point, this is at another church in another place, I had an actual fireplace. I know all of ours are just gas now, but this was an actual real fireplace. And I put the cards in the fireplace, and I took my lighter, and I lit them on fire. One of the most amazing things I've ever seen happen, and this is a true story. As I lit the cards in a big just pile of cards, I lit them on fire. I kid you not, the first card floated up on fire and disappeared. The second card floated up just like it afterwards. The third card floated up just like it. Now, I thought maybe the heat, I'm scientist and skeptical enough to think, well, the heat could cause each of the top cards to rise. But when it did it for every single card, and the cards at the bottom waited until it was their turn, instead of just burning up, I called my wife over, I called my kids over, and they all witnessed it. I said, are you seeing what I'm seeing? And they all said, I was like, every card is just floating, and they're like, oh yeah, Dad. One card after another just burned and floated. It was amazing. I'm not one that has a bunch of miracle stories. Some people I've heard have all these incredible things that have happened to them. But that was one where I had to pause and say, okay, God was at work. So if you don't think God is going to take your card seriously this morning, I know he will. And what you write on that card this morning between you and God, I want you to know he's going to do something about it. He's going to honor it. It's sacred. What we put on the altar this morning is sacred. And it's beautiful. So I just wanted to set the stage as we participate. This is an experience this morning. This is not Pastor Rick preaching at you. This is a worship experience that we're in together. And so we're going to journey now in Genesis 15 with Abraham. So the word of the Lord then came to Abraham. It said, this man, your servant, will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. And then he took Abraham outside, and he said to him, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. This is my promise to you, Abraham. Your offspring, coming from your own body, you will have a son, and the generations that come after him will be like the stars of the sky. And we are part of those stars, whether you know that or not. If you're a follower of God, you're a part of that lineage, because Abraham here in the Bible becomes kind of the genesis, as the name of the book suggests. He's the beginning. He's the beginning of this movement where God says, I'm going to have a chosen people. I'm going to show them who I am. I'm going to teach them how to live. I'm going to inspire them so that they can follow me and walk in my ways, and then they will be a light to the world. People will look to this nation and say, that's how it should be done. In that nation, there's peace. In that nation, there's joy. In that nation, there's love. In that nation, everybody is cared for and provided for. And in that nation, they have no king, but they follow the one true God. That was his plan. Now, we don't have to read much further in Genesis to know this plan. It was really rough. And over the time in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and as we get through the Bible, it just never seems to work out. That humanity in its sinfulness just keeps dropping the ball, keeps crumbling under the pressure of this plan. But God nevertheless uses the broken people, Abraham being the beginning, and moving all the way down to our time. And we are part of this lineage as followers of him. And what we need to understand is the experience of Abraham then is also our experience. And the promises made to Abraham are also promises God made to us. So when he says to Abraham, I am your shield, I am your very great reward, that is a promise God is making to you. He will be your shield. He will be your reward. He will look after you. He cares for you. He knows what you need. But like Abraham, his promises may seem kind of hollow because there may be something in your life that still hasn't come to be. You may feel like your life is not where it's supposed to be, that you haven't achieved what you had hoped. Things haven't worked out the way you wanted. Maybe there's even someone here who hasn't been able to have children, and you wanted to be able to have children, and you're wondering, God, why haven't we been able to conceive? And maybe there's just someone here whose career did not work out the way they thought it would, or whose relationship with their children is not going the way they wanted it, or their relationship with their parents, or there's some sort of stress or something that just seems lacking or missing. Maybe when you look at your childhood, you're like, it was a really rough childhood, and things happened to me as a child that weren't fair and weren't just, and other people have an advantage because they got to be raised in a good environment, and I never had the resources, I never had the options, I never had the benefits and the privileges that other people had. But I want to suggest to you that God sometimes denies us certain things because I think he wants us to want them more if they're good things. Because he wants us to pray more, because he wants us to ask more, because he's challenging us. In fact, when you read the Bible, it's almost like a rule that God uses our woundedness, the thing we lacked, to become the thing that he wants to bless us in. And so Abraham now is an old man, and by the way, he gives this promise to Abraham, yeah, you're going to have a son, you're going to have children, and then years go by, and he still doesn't have a child. Sometimes I think God wants us to be able to value what he's going to give us. And he wants to get us to that point where we could see that we could use it for others for good, that we will appreciate the value of it. We know this as parents, right? If you just hand your kids everything, how much do they value it? It just gets tossed aside or whatever. A mom will get me another, a dad will buy me another if it breaks, whatever. But if you make them work for it, suddenly that possession has a lot more value. They take better care of it. It's human nature. And I think sometimes God allows us to go without for a while so that we pray, so that we want it, so that we're looking, so that we're thirsting, so that when he gives us, we're ready, and then we realize it's a gift from him. It wasn't something we deserved. It wasn't something we were entitled to. In fact, one of the beautiful things about the Bible, and I think Abram will come to see this, is that we don't deserve anything. We didn't bring ourselves to life. That's a gift. Life is a gift from God. And so therefore, everything that comes through our life is also a gift from God, but it's not inherently ours, and we don't have a right to it. We can't get in God's face and say, no, you owe me this. You have to give me that. What rights do we have compared to the Creator and the divine? I want to suggest to you, once we start to understand that, then he can start to trust us with the gifts. I remember having a children's story in my church years ago where a woman told how she prayed and prayed as a child that God would heal her eyes because she had very bad vision from a young age. And when she went to kindergarten class with her huge, thick glasses because her vision was so bad, the kids kind of teased her and made fun of her, and she always was jealous that other kids could just see, and she had to put on these dumb glasses. And she said she prayed about it, and her parents would tell her these stories how Jesus heals and God heals, and she'd go to church and hear these stories that God can heal and answer our prayers, and she got really upset and discouraged over her young childhood years because God never healed her vision. She thought, why? It's so easy for him. He could just heal it. And what's it matter? It's just me, But she said she just, kept going, but she kept praying. And then she said one time, as she's gotten now as past her teenage years, she's about 20 years old, her parents say to her, you know what? There's this new thing. It's called LASIK. And we think that you should go to our eye doctor, and my new health insurance with my new employer, her dad's health insurance, who she was still on, covered LASIK, this new procedure. And they do this laser thing, and then you can see, and you have to wear glasses. You don't have to wear contacts. So she went, and the eye doctor looked at her, and he said, yeah, you're a perfect candidate. So she went, scheduled the surgery. They did the LASIK, and she said a few hours even after having the surgery, she's looking around. She's like, I've never been able to see like this. This is amazing. And she said the next morning after having the surgery, she woke up and for the first time in her entire life, she could read her alarm clock. And she said, wow. And she told the children something which I thought was fascinating. She said, for years I asked God to heal my eyes, and I didn't think he was answering my prayer. And I wondered why he didn't care, and I wondered why he couldn't just do it for me, and I went through all of that. But she said, what I didn't know is every time I was praying, God was working on a plan not to just heal my eyes, but to heal thousands of people's eyes. And he told these eye doctors how to develop this technique and how to get the technology so that they could heal people's eyes. And now I stand before you, she said, I can see everything clearly. I haven't had to wear glasses for years and contacts or any of that, and neither have thousands of other people who have had the same procedure. I thought that was one of the most remarkable children's stories I ever heard. I still remember it. It's beautiful. Don't give up praying just because you haven't seen the answer yet. God wants you to pray. If you're seeking something good, he will fill it. Now, I can't tell you how he'll answer it because God answers our prayers in creative ways and different ways. I remember another lady telling me that she couldn't have children, and it was really discouraging. She went for years trying and doing all the treatments and different things, and she was a school teacher. And she said she finally, one day, she was praying to God about it and all of this, and God said to her, she said, clear as day, your children are in the classroom. Every child in that classroom is your child. And she said that's all she needed to hear. And from that moment on, she said she had peace, and now she teaches with great joy, and she loves every child in her class because that's her child. That's who God gave her. And that's her purpose. And she was at peace with that, and God spoke to her, and that's all she needed. For God to tell her, this is what it is for you. So I don't know where you're at in your life. I don't know what you're missing. But before we get to what we're missing, I want to ask you to look at your paper and put a number 1 and put the gift. You can write on your index card, the gift. If you need a pen or pencil, wave your hand. We'll get you one. And under the gift, this is between you and God. This morning, this is all between you and God. It's not between you and anyone else. I want you to think about what is a gift that God has given you, because if you've lived long enough, God has done something in your life. Maybe it's an experience, maybe it's a moment, maybe it's a person. I just want us to pause before we get to the rest of this. We need to think about, how has God blessed me? How has God done something for me? What is it? And you might have to put 2 or 3 things, that's fine, but key moments, big things where you saw God step in, where you saw that God said, I'm going to give you this. For me, I can look back. Every time I've moved has been a gift from God. It's been providential. And every time I've moved, I've wondered, is this the right move? Should I go? Should I move? It's a big deal when you move, right? And every time I look back and go, oh yeah, I see why God wanted me there. I see why God led me to this place. I see. It's so clear. Now, you don't always know it in the moment, but when you look back, you go, oh, God's hand was in that. Way more than I could have ever realized. So whatever it is for you, I just want you to write that on. That's between you and God. I want you to give him the praise. And we want to take a moment and praise God by giving, and we're going to invite our children to come forward and have the children's offering. I'm going to ask Dr. Morris to call for the children's offering. We'll do that, and then we'll have some songs together between this message. But write down a gift that God has given you. Many years go by, and finally, the long-awaited child comes. By this time, Sarah and Abraham are well beyond the years when you could have a child. And it says in Genesis 21, now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised. Abraham gave him the name Isaac, which means laughter, to the son of Sarah that was born to him. This is Genesis 21. There's much rejoicing. This is a miracle. I don't know when you put down what you put down for your gift, if it was one of those moments where you're just like, wow, I can't believe God did this, or wow, God just came through in such an unexpected and awesome way. Maybe it was a job that you just never thought you would ever be eligible for, and they call you and say, you got it. And maybe it's meeting just that right person, or maybe it's the day you held your first child in your arms and you just marveled at the gift. But this day when Isaac is born is a day of celebration. And I wrote a play when I was in college that we did that was called the Geriatric Baby Shower. Because can you imagine the baby shower for Sarah with her friends who are all like in their 90s, and they're coming in on canes and walkers, and it would be kind of different, but what a miracle. And so Isaac is born, and of course Isaac is treasured and valued, and years go by and we think, wow, what a wonderful story. We can just wrap it up here. We know that Isaac would later marry Rebekah, and they'd have kids, and eventually it would grow into a bigger family and pass on through generations, and we would eventually get to where we had the children of Israel, and they would be set free from Egypt, and we kind of know the whole lineage. But the story doesn't just go off into the sunset with this peaceful and wonderful miracle. We have this interesting plot twist in Genesis 22, the next chapter. We know many years have gone by the time we get to Genesis 22. And it says, sometime later God came to Abraham and he said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, here I am. God said to him, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Okay, this is not what we expect. This is not like God. This makes no sense. After Abraham and Sarah pleaded for years, they get this miracle baby, and then God just kind of matter-of-factly comes to Abraham one day and says, oh, by the way, you know that great gift I gave you? Hey, why don't you go offer him as a burnt offering and worship me on the mountain, and then, just little thing I'm asking from you today. I can't even imagine what Abraham thought when he got this request. And we, as Westerners living some 4,000 years later, have a lot of issues with this request. In fact, where should we start? I'm pretty sure there's this little organization called CPS, Child Protective Services, that should be called at this moment, because Abraham starts packing his bags. I know whenever I'm in Sabbath school or in a class or a small group where we're discussing this story, people are always offended by the request. And how do we know if it was really God asking? And if that happened to us, are we supposed to go do it? And we kind of put our own, 21st century values on this thing and our own experience. And I just want to point out a few things. First of all, this experience has nothing to do whether God would ever ask you to sacrifice your child. Because the answer to that question is no. God has never asked anyone else ever to do this. This is one person, and you have to understand who this person was, and you'll start to understand why he asks. This person is the beginning of the people of God. And so his experience is our experience, and every person who would follow. And God is showing something. God is teaching something. And man, there is no better way to teach a lesson than to actually put you through it. Now, God could have told Abraham a nice story about sacrificing a son, but it wouldn't have gotten the lesson across, and we wouldn't have been interested about it. But the first thing you have to notice here is, who is this son? This son is the miracle child. This son came from two parents who were not able to have children. Not only were they not able when they were healthy, they were now to the age where it was impossible. So God brings a child, if you will, follow me here, out of nothing. He brings something out of nothing. This is a symbol. Isaac now becomes a symbol of another child who would come from heaven. Another child who would come as a gift. For God so loved the world that he gave his only, did you catch the wording? by the way, what God says to Abraham? Take your son, your one and only. Same wording as we have in John 3:16, the most famous passage in all of Christianity. Take your one and only. God could have just said, take your son. He said, no, take your one and only, the divine gift, the one I gave you, the one that was sent to you, the one that was given to you from heaven, because God will so love the world that he will send his one and only Son, that whosoever should believe in him should have everlasting life, should not perish, but have everlasting life. But that everlasting life would come at a price. And God now is entering Abraham into a living parable, into a living metaphor. And if you don't think this is profound, look at all the things that God puts in this story. First of all, it's your one and only son. Secondly, you're going to offer him up as an offering. And you're going to take him to one of the mountains that I will tell you about. By the way, this Hebrew word for mountain is the same word for hill. There's no separation here. There's another hill that we think about this Easter weekend, don't we? It's a hill called Golgotha. When they marched God's one and only Son out of a city onto this hill and crucified him, sacrificed him. He shed his blood. And by the way, Jesus said to us, no one takes my life. I give it. I lay it down. When his disciples rose up to fight for him in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, put your swords away. You don't think I could call angels and be delivered right now? But this must happen. This is why I came. This is what my purpose was. And I find this fascinating, this story of Abraham and Isaac, because this happened, as best we can tell, some 1,800 years before Christ ever came. 1,800 years, this story occurs. This story would be told, it would be written about long before Christ comes. It would be passed down from generation to generation. They would tell the story of Abraham offering Isaac, not knowing what was going to come. Not knowing that they were telling the story before the story happened. In fact, I would say to any of us who are skeptical at times, and I don't know how my atheist friends would view this, but to me it seems pretty remarkable that so much of one story is found 1,800 years before. Like, how did that happen? It's like God knew. It was going to happen. And he put it in there. And Abraham and Isaac start to act out the story of our Heavenly Father giving his son. Well, Abraham, early the next morning, verse 3 of Genesis 22, got up, saddled his donkey, took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. There's so much symbolism here. Did you notice there's a donkey in this story? Now, why did we need to know that? So what? Of course he'd probably take a donkey or a camel or something. No, actually it's probably interesting that he took a donkey and not a camel. Camel are very common in that time. We knew that Abraham had camels. You know how we know Abraham had lots of camels? Because he sent camels with his servant to find Rebekah for Isaac. 10 camels, it said. He loaded them up, took them off on the journey. But for some reason, he chooses a donkey. A donkey is now leading this journey. A donkey's coming on this journey. And it reminds me because when Jesus rode into Jerusalem, he came with a donkey. Like God knew. And then it's interesting because the next verse says, in verse 4, on the third day, Abraham arrived at the mountain, at the place. It was a 3-day journey. Third day. So much symbolism in this story. And he said, Abraham, to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We're going to climb the hill. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." And this word for come back to you, it's the word return. It's used all throughout Hebrew. It means something is gone, and then it comes back. And you remember our scripture reading this morning from the book of Hebrews. The author of Hebrews, some 2,000 years later, looking back on the story of Abraham, says, Abraham was a man of faith, so much so that he was willing to offer his own son, trusting that God could do what? Do you remember what the verse said that we read? Trusting that God could, I think we can put it up here, magic. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. You see, there's something in Abraham's relationship with God that I really want for myself. He knew God so well. He thought that God was so good. He trusted God so much, and he loved God so much, and he trusted God's heart so much that he said, you know what? If God were to ask me to sacrifice my own son, he's so good, he'll probably bring him back to life. That's just God. He's not going to just take from me. He wouldn't just give me a gift and then say, ha, hope you enjoyed it, now it's mine. Like, that's not who God is. Abraham knew the character of God. In fact, I think that Abraham and God were so close that they had this intimate friendship. And I think one of the things that hurts our relationship with God is we don't think about that he might want our friendship. But whenever you read about men and women of God in the Bible or in other books that God has had great men and women all throughout history, whenever you read their story with God, you start to see that God seems to be like, it's like a give and take, like a real friendship. Like he wants them to understand things about him, and he wants to show them things, and he wants to have that give and take that you have with your best and closest friends. In fact, I want to suggest to you that the real reason that God is doing this is not just to teach Abraham some lesson, not just to set up some sort of test to see if Abraham was faithful or good enough. It's because God was going to give his own son. God knew he was going to give his own son, and God wanted to show his closest friend his heart so that Abraham would know how much God really did love humanity. And they get to the top of the mountain. Look what happens here. It says, well, first in verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, and he placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself, that being Abraham, carried the fire and the knife. You catch the symbolism? They're going to climb up the mountain, and Abraham places the wood on Isaac. He's carrying the wood up the mountain, just like a wooden cross was placed on Jesus for him to carry up the hill. And they make the journey, and by the way, this is evidence that Abraham was much older now. Isaac was much older. Some stories I've heard it told where Isaac's like a child. He's not a child here. He's a grown man. He is mature enough. He's carrying the wood, not his father. And so he's carrying the heavier load. He's carrying that up to the top. And the only thing we know about Isaac's age at this time is that Isaac's mother would die when he was like 36 or 37. Sarah would die when Isaac was 36 or 37. So we know that this story happened before she was gone, because they come back and they tell Sarah about it. So Sarah's still alive. But we also know he must be old enough to carry the wood and all of that, so he must be grown at this point. And I just wonder, I don't know for a fact, but I just wonder if Isaac was 33. That maybe God, knowing what was coming, said, Abraham, I want to show you something. This is something I'm going to go through, and I want you to understand my heart. And take your 33-year-old son and go to this mountain. And they get to the top of the hill, the mountain, if you will. And Isaac, obviously being older, he notices what's pretty obvious at the point where they're at the top. He says in verse 7, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the offering? Where indeed is the lamb?" And Abraham answered him, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And they continued on up the mountain. When they reached the place where God had told him, Abraham built an altar, and I'm sure it was probably a little bigger and better than this, and they had a lot more big stones over there, and apparently they took some time, they built the altar. They arranged the wood on top of the altar. And it says in verse 9 at the end, he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, Abraham's quite up in years at this point. He is very elderly. Isaac, we know, is probably grown. That tells you something. If Abraham wants to bind Isaac's hands, Isaac's going to have to cooperate. Because Isaac's at the age where he could overpower his dad pretty easily. And all we don't hear anything about Isaac, except that now he allows his hands to be bound and he lays down on the altar. Another son, the Son of God, would come to the Garden of Gethsemane. And as he was preparing to offer himself as a sacrifice, he would beg, as he was feeling the weight of the sins, he would beg his Father, if there's any other way, God, Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. Please, I don't know if I can go through with this. I'm being crushed by the weight of the sins of this world. But he said this incredible phrase, "But not my will, but thine be done." So Isaac lays on the altar, "Not my will, but thine be done." And I don't know what that moment was like, but I know as a parent, there's nothing worse to me than seeing my child suffer. I know that I would rather suffer than to watch my child suffer. There is nothing more hideous, more vile, more cruel than for a parent to have to watch their child being tortured. We would rather be tortured than to watch our child be tortured. And so for Abraham to look at his son on that altar had to be a powerful moment. Gut-wrenching moment. Because you have to know, no matter how great his faith, there's a part of him that's wondering, is this it? Because he has no guarantee what's going to happen next. And God watched his son be beaten, flogged, spit upon, mocked, hour after hour after hour. We talk about what a great sacrifice Jesus made, but do we ever think about the Father? Which role was harder? I'm not sure. To be the sacrifice or to be the one offering your son, your child? Both are pretty bad. You must care a lot to make that kind of sacrifice. So he lies on the wood, and it says that Abraham reached out his hand, he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. For now I know you fear God, because you have not withheld your only son." And Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket was a ram. What must it have been like for Abraham and Isaac? I wonder how that changed their relationship to God. I wonder if God somehow communicated that he too would give his only son at some point. I wonder if they knew that or if they just were an object lesson. You have your piece of paper in front of you. I want you to write number 2, the sacrifice. Number 1 was the gift. Number 2, the sacrifice. And under that, I want you to write something. I want you to talk to God, to pray silently as we sing our next song or just as the service continues. What is something that you think God is asking you to put on the altar this morning? Something that you can offer to him, because I can tell you, if you get too attached to things of this world, they will eventually hinder your growth. They will hinder your walk with God. They will hinder God's plan for your life. And maybe it's a child, maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a stress, maybe it's your job. Maybe there's something in your life that is really making it difficult for you to put God first. Or maybe it's not to that point, but you could see how it could get to that point. It's between you and God, whatever you want to put. You're going to put something on that line that you're going to put on the altar this morning, that you're going to give to God. It will be your burnt offering this morning. What is it that God is calling you to give him? Between you and him. And know that when you bring it on the altar, that's it. You're giving it to him. Let him do with it what he will. He may give it back to you. He may give you something even better in its place. I don't know. But you have to leave it at the altar. Don't bring it to the altar if you're not ready to leave it go. Let it go. To release it to him. To trust him. Let him prove himself. You might not think you have the faith this morning to really do it. Just do it. I think you'll learn that he's very trustworthy. That we live in a sinful world where death is the reality, and all of us are born terminally ill. That we all will experience pain. We all will suffer at some point in this world. And we recognize in the story of Abraham that God at times calls us to suffer, but he will use that suffering for good. 3 years ago, after a long and difficult process, my wife of that time and I decided to divorce. If you've been through divorce, you don't wish it on anyone, even if it's the right thing or a, quote, good thing. It's a very hard thing. And for both of us, it was very difficult, but for me especially, because my girls said to me, well, Dad, we don't really want to go back and forth between two homes. Can we just stay with Mom, and then, if you live nearby, we can do stuff with you, but we just don't want to have all of that. And they're older, and I said, okay. And so I decided that I would pay for the place that they were living, which left me very little money to pay for a place for me to live, but I rented a room. And the day I moved out and packed my belongings out of my own house, away from my own girls, I wept like I've never wept before. I didn't even know I was capable of that level of weeping and pain. It was pretty sad if you saw it. But you didn't, so that's good. My brother came over and he helped me. And I thank God for him that day because God used him. I would not have made it through that day without him. The day was a blur. It was I was an emotional wreck. I moved my things into some stranger's room. And after 19 years, I sat in this little room and said, what next? Why? Why, God? I tried everything. I tried everything. Why, God? I prayed, I prayed, I prayed, I loved, I tried. I wasn't perfect, but I tried. I didn't give up. And some of those first few nights going to bed in this little room that didn't feel like mine without my girls and without my family, it felt like they had been killed in a car wreck or something. Because where were they? Why weren't they there? And then later, the conference said, well, we need to deal with this reality that you're divorced. Not everybody wants a divorced pastor. They didn't say it this way, but I know what they're thinking. So they had a committee, and I had to go and appear before a committee and answer questions and see, I guess, if I was going to be allowed to be a pastor. And I said to God, well, how much are you going to take from me? And the committee was very generous, and it was not a bad thing. It's just one of those weird things that you never think would have to happen to you. And we got through that, and they voted, there's no grounds for him not to be a pastor. We believe he did everything he could, and this is the reality of our sinful world. But they said, we do want to give you some time off during this time. I said, okay. And so they put me on paid leave, which was great. Except, paid leave. Yeah, they were generous. I'm not throwing the conference. They were generous. You guys don't have to be so jealous. Hold on. I'm going through a rough time. When you're doing great, paid leave is awesome. I get it. All right. I'm sorry. Don't ruin my moment here. You're getting hung up on that paid leave. Let me tell you what paid leave did to me, though. It means for a number of months, I woke up every day, and every external identity I had was gone. I'm not a husband. I don't feel like a father. And I'm no longer a pastor. My name has been for 20 years Pastor Rick. Now I'm just Rick. And everything that I had in just a little bit of time disappeared. Even to the point where I'm living in someone else's room with barely any items. My ex is in the house with all the stuff we accumulated. And I sat there in that little room. And I said, God, it's almost funny because you have showed me all these stories. I know Abraham's story. I know Job's story. I know David. You have told me all along that this is what often happens to people when they follow you. But I still don't want it to happen. I know I'm not supposed to cling to the things of this world. I know that you probably have a plan. I know that through this whole experience that feels very much like death, that you can provide resurrection, but I still hate it. And honestly, I don't have the faith to even worry about what comes next. I'm just trying to get up in the morning, find some joy, do some of the things that I know I need to do. And just somewhere in the back of my head, hope, some distant thing in the back says, maybe things will be different one day. But today it's just survival. Today I just cry. Today I just mourn. And I don't know where you're at in your life. Somebody may be on that day right now. But it's 3 years later. It's 3 years later. I live in a bigger house. I got to be careful where I go with this. I got to be really careful. Let's just say, in all things, God has blessed me. And guess what? I'm a better person. I'm much more sympathetic. When I meet someone in pain, I recognize it much quicker now than I used to. I didn't know what debilitating pain was until that happened to me. I didn't know what it's like to feel hopeless, even though mentally you could say, yeah, I know there should be hope. I know God doesn't give up. I know all these stories that in the end they somehow work out. But to just still, it doesn't matter when you're in that much pain, when you've had that much loss. What I do know is all of us will have some loss of one thing or another. Hopefully it will not come in a big degree or in a big dramatic way. But if it has for you, I want to give you hope. I want to point you to Abraham, who willingly parted with the gift that answered all his prayers. Because you have a choice. Because even if the loss happened to you 15 years ago, even if this is something from your childhood, you right now, right this minute, have a choice to let it go. Do you know that? You say, no, it was taken from me. No, I had no choice. No, you have the choice right now to let it go, to put it on the altar, and to say, God, I hate that this happened. It was so hard, but I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to let it go, and I'm going to just trust that you're going to redeem whatever was taken from me. You're going to bless. You're going to heal this broken heart, because we live with the one whose wounds heal us. We don't live with a distant God who looks down and says, so sorry you're suffering. One day it'll be nice up here with me. We live with a God who looked down in our suffering and says, I'm going in. A God who says, look at all these people being abused, victimized, tortured, punished, hurt, wounded, innocent, stolen. I'm going to go down there and be a baby and be just as vulnerable as any one of them. And they did abuse him. And they did victimize him, and they did torture him, and they did anything they wanted to him. I can't even comprehend a love like that. He didn't have to come. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to leave. He had everything was safe and perfect in heaven. Why would you come to this incredibly dangerous, painful, awful place? It's because he loves us. For God so loved the world that he sent his son, and that he came, and he laid down on the altar, and he became our provision. He became the fulfillment of the statement of Abraham, the Lord will provide. And the Lord will provide for you, because he's in the provision business. He did it for Abraham almost 4,000 years ago, and he's been doing it for man and woman ever since. Everybody that has followed him, no matter what you're going through, no matter what you've been through, if you will bring it to the altar, if you will worship, he will redeem. If you will allow him to take it, he will replace with what he can fill you with. He is the healer. He is the provider. He is the one. He is not only the boy, but he's the father. He's not only the boy and the father, he's the ram in the thicket that they would offer instead. And so number 3 on your card as we close this morning. Number 3 on your card, you can put the provision. The provision. And I want you to talk to God in the quietness of this final few moments. What do you need God to provide for you? Ask and it will be given, he says. What do you need God to provide for you? Anything you want to put on there, something. It can be healing. It could be something very tangible. It could be a relationship that needs to be restored. It could be forgiveness. It could be just the power to let go of these wounds and hurts that just seemed to overwhelm you, and you're always triggered by the pain of the past, and you can't seem to just find new health and new healing and new hope and a new life. Whatever you want to put there, it's between you and God. God, what do I want you to provide for me? So we're going to acknowledge the gift this morning. We're going to put something on the altar to sacrifice it. And then we're going to look forward to his provision. Now, I should warn you, Isaac was born very late in life. God's timing sometimes is a little different than what we wish. Sometimes it's not as fast. Sometimes he's doing things to prepare us for a bigger provision than we could ever imagine. But stay with him. He hears your prayer. He hears your cry. When you call out to God, he knows it. When you place this card on the altar this morning, he is going to honor that. I know he will. This is your burnt offering this Easter service because you have learned, or you're going to take a chance to trust a God who would care so much that he would offer his only son.